Hello, everybody. It is John Pollock and Wei Ting, and this is our special gift to you, the listener. It is our Rocky 1 review that we put out a couple of weeks ago. It was applauded by everybody. It went down in history as one of the greatest shows we have ever put out, and we just couldn't withhold it from everybody else. So here it is, the free version of our Rocky 1 review. Everyone's talking about the director's cut of Rocky 4 that's going to be coming out. This is the podcaster's cut of the Rocky 1 review with John Pollock and the Apollo to my Rocky, Wei Ting.
We just decided to embark on this adventure that's going to take us months and months and months to go through. We're about to review Rocky 2 next week, so get caught up with us. Listen to this Rocky review. And if you enjoy it, consider signing up for the Post Wrestling Cafe. $6 a month gets you access to all of our shows for a very important September for us. Probably one of our most important and busy months of output. Not only do you get all of our Rocky reviews, you get our entire catalog of MCU reviews that's just sitting there right now waiting for you. It's calling your name. Ask Away, a SmackDown every single Friday on Rewind-A-SmackDown. And if that's not enough, G1 coverage beginning in September as well. All that for $6 a month.
That's it. All of that, $6 a month. We're also going to be going live after All Out this Saturday, as we will be for Clash of Champions. So for Double, Ice Cap, and Espresso patrons, you have live access to our post-pay-per-view shows. But the big stuff this month will be the G1 reviews, and next week, on Tuesday, our review of Rocky 2. So you can get all set, get our thoughts on the first film as we dive into the sequel, the rematch, next week. So, the words that I said to myself right after we finished this show. Yo, Adrian, we did it.
Enjoy.
Would you be interested in fighting Apollo Creed for the World Heavyweight Championship?
No.
Listen, Rocky. Apollo's seen you fight. He likes you. He wants to fight you.
Well, it's just that you see, I fight in clubs, and I'm really a ham and egg. This guy, he's the best, and it wouldn't be such a good fight. But thank you very much, I appreciate it and all that.
Rocky, do you believe that America is the land of opportunity?
Yeah.
Apollo Creed does. And he's going to prove it to the whole world by giving an unknown a shot at the title. And that unknown is you. He picked you, Rocky. Rocky, it's the chance of a lifetime. You can't pass it by. What do you say?
Hello, everybody. It's John Pollock and Wei Ting, and welcome to a brand new era of movie reviews.
Yeah, brand new era, I would say so. I mean, after we've just completed essentially what took 2 years, this would certainly qualify as a different era. And it'll be very different going from like a comic book movie to this.
It's a big shift, yes. I'm looking forward to these, though. We've got 6 Rocky films, and then we got 2 Creed films. And by the time we're done this, maybe we're like on the cusp of Creed 3.
I know that they had announced that it was in production, but I mean, I feel like it's just starting production.
I don't think they had even started shooting, Way. I think they were still fine. Like they were, I won't say the infancy, like it had been announced, but I mean, just in researching for this show, looking at it, like it wasn't even, like they weren't even knowing if Stallone would be part of the film because he had looked at Creed 2 as being kind of his, the final film. So yeah, I mean, who knows how long that's going to be delayed other than it's in the pipeline, but so are, like, think of how backed up Hollywood must be from shooting schedules and people that have, for big actors and actresses, like 2 years worth of films that are probably lined up and that timetable is all out the window. So you've got to make decisions like what projects are you taking over other commitments you had and what gets pushed to the back burner. Like it's going to be a mess for years, I would think, based on how much, like how limited production has been over these couple of months.
Completely. At the same time, I mean, much like in the way we're seeing with sports, with just, every sport league running at the same time, whenever things do end up like, opening back up and becoming normal, I can just imagine a summer of just every single blockbuster coming out like within succession. It's going to be crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, as someone that doesn't have a financial stake on the health of any of these films' performances, I mean, just as a bystander watching it, I'm intrigued to see what happens in all of this. But I mean, it really does show you like the impact of just the world we're living in, to just watch like the final scene of Rocky where they're in an arena, and it's like, how could you shoot that now?
Digitally, CGI.
I guess you do have certain advantages that 1976 did not. So I guess they do have that going for them.
Well, CGI would be quite tough to do on a $1 million budget, which even for 1976 seemed like it was a pretty small budget at the time. Before we get going, like, tell me about kind of your history with the series. When was the first time you you saw your first Rocky film? And yeah.
I'm trying to remember that. I'm pretty sure the first Rocky film I watched was Rocky IV, so I didn't even watch it in order. And I feel that one I would have watched when I was a really young kid. And as I was trying to recall, that there was a summer when maybe it was CTV in Canada, they aired the Rocky movies every night for a week straight, all 5 of them. And I remember like they put them on late too, something like 11 p.m., midnight, something like that. So for a week, my brother and I used our handy device known as a VCR recorder and recorded the images that were being projected on the television, that then you would do something called a rewind. And the following day, because we were home from school during the summer, we would watch the Rocky films. And I think we watched all 5 that week.
That's amazing. Wow.
I guess I was like 11 or 12 maybe seeing these. And then, just watching them sporadically throughout. I'm sure I saw them like a handful of times in my life.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I was born in 1984. So by that time, I believe there had already been several iterations of this film. And, certainly by the time I was watching older films or even watching like, more adult movies, not those types of adult movies.
Oh, I was going to say, Way was busy at 12.
But I mean,
that was the other, that was late at night on City TV, not on CTV.
Yeah, sure. Different channel. But certainly by the time I got to like watching movies made for older audiences, like I'd known about Rocky, of course. Like by this point, like in the 90s, it was already a big part of pop culture. Certainly, things like Running Up the Steps. These were like just things you would see parodied and referenced in across all sorts of like TV shows and things like that. So I feel
the Lipton Brisk iced tea commercials. I mean, that was
right.
A lot of people's gateway.
I guess
it's
so.
Brisk, baby.
Yeah, but unlike Star Wars, which had like a 90s re-release, like I never really had a proper like full-on reason to go back to rewatch or watch for the first time like these films that started off in the 70s. So I had always known the story, but had never really had an excuse to dive into it until like I would say I'm trying to think if I like ended up watching Creed first, actually. Like I might have been like that late to it, where like I might have just saw Creed and then went back to watch the original Rocky film.
Well, that's really recent then.
Yeah. So obviously at this point, like relatively easy to go back and rewatch everything. And I'll say, like, with this being the first one, these films are very different from one another. When you go through from Rocky 1 all the way till like Rocky Balboa, each film really has its own like style and tone.
They do. And as we will get into them further, I mean, certainly a reflection of the time period as well. And I mean, you will heavily see that in Rocky IV, but I mean, yeah, all of these you're looking at, different kind of slices of their time period, with the first Rocky being, for most people, like it's the first Rocky film that they see. And for many, like this is the standard bearer. Like this was an enormous phenomenon in Hollywood, and to juxtapose to today, like, I don't think this project gets done in its current form today. Like putting an unknown actor who had just done a handful of films at this point, cast as the lead, doing something on this $1 million budget. Like, I don't think this gets made in the way that we remembered it. And it is a drastically different movie if this is pitched today.
Right. I mean, I do think you might still have instances of, like, you know, companies taking a chance on a small budget film with, like, you know, an unknown star being cast as a lead. But, you know, $1 million seems like it's a lot of money, but I even back then, I have to imagine it probably, because, like, hearing all these stories afterwards of, like, the amount of, like, restrictions that, you know, Stallone and the producers had in trying to create this film, it didn't even seem like a whole lot of money at that point. So,
and you can't even call it, like, this is like Talia Shire, who plays Adrian, like, is a very accomplished actress by this point. Like, this is, you know, she's coming off the Godfather films.
Yeah.
Or at least the first one. Yeah.
Both of them, actually. The other one.
Okay, they've done two had already come out by now. So, I mean, that's a huge get for them in that role. And, I mean, Burgess Meredith. I mean, the Penguin, for Christ's sake, you've got. I mean,
that's
doesn't come much more in demand than him in 1976.
So before we dive into this one, maybe we'll talk a bit more about sort of some of the behind the scenes of how this thing came together. I have some notes here if you wouldn't mind, John. Feel free to chime in anytime you want.
Yep.
So as you mentioned, Stallone was a very relatively unknown actor at the time, having only had very small roles or, you know, background extra work. The producers here, Chardoff and Winkler, they became interested in Sylvester Stallone primarily as a writer after reading one of his scripts for a movie called Paradise Alley. Have you seen Paradise Alley?
You know what? I haven't seen Paradise Alley, and it's certainly quite the tie-in.
So Paradise Alley, for people unaware, was a film starring also Sylvester Stallone, but based around professional wrestling. And in fact, stars a number of professional wrestlers, primarily Terry Funk. So he sold the script for Paradise Alley, wouldn't go on to make it until after Rocky came out. But by this time, they wanted to purchase originally Paradise Alley, but he had already sold it. So instead of, Paradise Alley, Stallone said, can I do something else for you guys? And the producers invited him to write a new script for an idea that they had, or at least they wanted a boxing film, and Stallone happened to have an idea for a boxing film. He reportedly wrote this screenplay for Rocky in 3 days, working for 20 straight hours, feeling very inspired after watching a match between Muhammad Ali and Chuck Wepner in March of 1975. Did you know much about this story, John?
Yeah, I mean, that had always been the legend that this movie was inspired from that fight. And then in years after the fact, I mean, Stallone would really downplay that as the influence. And there was actually a lawsuit that was filed by Wepner. And they had this, largely Wepner felt that, hey, I should be cut into all of this, which, I mean, we can get into it too about, Stallone. This was very much his baby, but it's not like this guy had any ownership of this thing either. I mean, he had to sacrifice a lot to get this movie made. But ESPN did a documentary about this whole story a few years back. But that was, and Chuck Wepner, of course, he had his ties doing the match with Andre the Giant at Shea Stadium. So different worlds connected here in the Rocky origin.
When you say ownership, what do you mean?
In terms of like the licenses and having a stake in like the Rocky franchise, Sylvester Stallone did not have a piece of that. Like that was owned by the studios. So when you see like Rocky licensed to other like just merchandise and video games or anything to do with the Rocky, just to have an ownership stake in like the intellectual property of it, he didn't get any of that. And he talked about this in an interview over the past couple of years, that was something just to get a few percentage points would have been astronomical. Like he gets $2.5 million for this first film. And granted, I mean, Sylvester Stallone has done all right. He's been okay. But it does tell you like the studios had the overall control of this thing.
Is that to this day, or did he end up like renegotiating something?
This was only like 4 or 5 years ago that Variety did this big story about the ownership thing. And to my knowledge, it has not changed since then.
Oh, wow. So, for people who I guess aren't aware of this particular match between Muhammad Ali and Chuck Wepner, Ali was a huge favorite and Wepner was a heavy underdog that ended up making it all the way to the 15th and final round before getting TKO'd by Ali. So, exactly.
Clearly was not inspired because we didn't get a TKO.
I guess not. Completely different story here. The studio.
Did you feel Chuck? Sorry, finish your.
No. I was just about to move on, but you were going to say?
Okay, let's look at that. And granted, we don't know all we can't get into
Does
Sylvester
Chuck
Stallone's
Wepner
head.
deserve a cut, is what you're saying?
Does he, maybe not even like a financial cut, but to me, is there a screenplay out there that doesn't have an inspiration behind it? Like, yes, you could take like this fight, the concept of Ali and Chuck Wepner, but to me, that doesn't write out a whole script. That doesn't produce this film. So I believe Stallone, like if that was the seed that was planted, I think that credit should be acknowledged, but I can't say that Chuck Wepner deserves a financial cut of the success of this film, that the germ of the idea came from this fight with Ali and Chuck Wepner. There are lots of people who watched that fight that did not produce this gigantic film.
Absolutely. Agreed. I mean, I don't even know what legal ground Chuck Wepner would have had to stand on, to be honest with you. Like, would Muhammad Ali have had a claim to it as well in that case?
Like if you draw upon like a real life experience and you write a song, like, is the girl that broke your heart financially inclined to get a cut of your sales? Like, if so, like Taylor Swift would be paying in perpetuity to ex-boyfriends.
Whoa, imagine that.
Heartbreak sells.
I guess so, yeah. No, personally, I feel like, I don't know. There's a movie about Chuck Wepner that's out there too, where like some of this stuff is documented. So his story is certainly really interesting. I'd like to know a bit more, but I haven't, like, just on the surface, I don't really understand the argument, but I'm sure there's a bit more to it than maybe we're just suggesting here.
Listen, if this film flopped and it didn't go anywhere, I don't think he's really making it. It's because it was such a big, it was just a gigantic success that, I mean, this is someone that sees like, hey, I'm sure there was legal representation that said, yeah, of course you have a case. Mm-hmm. And you want to hear that. It's like, hey, if I could get a cut of this, I applaud him for trying, but if I was a judge, I don't know how much I would give based on your fight was the inspiration behind what this led to. Like, Stallone did the work. You know what I mean?
Yes. So the studio, United Artists, they were originally hoping to cast a known star like a James Caan or a Burt Reynolds for this role. But Sylvester Stallone was... Can you imagine either of those two as Rocky?
No, I can't at all. But, today, absolutely, one of those would have been cast over Sylvester Stallone. I think 100%. Like, it's such a star vehicle. Like, that's just the way films are cast these days, that you go with the guaranteed thing of someone with, it'd be Dwayne Johnson that they'd be trying to get to play Rocky Balboa today instead of some unknown writer that presented you with this script. So, I mean, I'm glad it turned out this way, because I cannot imagine Burt Reynolds making it to Rocky 2.
Rocky. Rocky with a mustache. I think James Caan would have been interesting, but I mean, honestly, like, you see the end result, and it's really hard to picture anybody but Stallone. Stallone was very adamant that he starred in his own film. And after much negotiation, including some budget cuts, as well as like something about a crossover deal between this and a Martin Scorsese film that was about to come out at the time called, I believe it was New York, mm-hmm. something like that.
That's right.
Like there was
lost money, right?
There was a cross deal that basically said, okay, so we're gonna take a chance on this indie boxing film, but as long as this Scorsese film, which is very likely to make money, as long as that generates money, we can cover all the losses. What ended up happening was Scorsese's film bombed, and Rocky ended up doing tremendously well. So it actually helped the other way around. So, hey, some gambles pay off, and that is all to set up Rocky from 1976, directed by John G. Avildsen, produced by Erwin Winkler and Robert Chardoff, written by Sylvester Stallone, of course. Shall we go through a brief recap of it all?
You just handle the reins, Way.
Okay, and you just jump in with any thoughts that you have. It is November of 1975, weeks before 1976, the date of America's bicentennial. So Rocky Balboa, at this point, is a 30-year-old local Philadelphia boxer who really just is a hobbyist at this point. He makes money primarily as a loan shark collector. So this movie opens up with a fight, which I really at this point can best describe as some sort of underground.
Yeah, this was Philadelphia underground with
Yes.
What was his name? Rico.
Yes. So Rocky, Shane McMahon is there, just like calling all challengers.
Stand him up. I
Yep.
guess that really doesn't apply to our boxing motif
not.
here, but nonetheless.
Rocky barely squeaks by some bum and earns himself $40 for this win. But despite this win, you can clearly see that nobody around in this world gives him any credit for it. His quarterman tells him that he should think about quitting. His opponent says he got lucky. We take a trip through the streets of Philadelphia, and it's very grungy, this is a low-income neighborhood. It's very apparent. Rocky walks home, and he practices a joke about turtle food that he intends to tell his crush at the pet store, Adrian, played, of course, by Talia Shire. She's an incredibly shy woman who doesn't really seem to react at all to his advances. She also happens to be his best friend's sister, Paulie, played by Burt Young, who
is a dirtbag in this film. Becomes more of a lovable character, but my God, is he just despicable in this film.
Incredibly unlikable. He demonstrates the lowest opinion possible of his sister. He's even violent and verbally abusive towards her to like an uncomfortable degree, and won't understand why Rocky is into her. So we see Rocky at his day job, which is being a loan shark. Even the loan shark chastises Rocky, for like, he's got a very shady job, but he has sympathy for the people that he has to collect money from. And so his loan shark chastises Rocky for not breaking the dude's thumbs like he was supposed to. The man's too nice. We see him at his boxing gym where his locker has been given away by his owner, the coach who owns the gym, Mickey, played, of course, by Burgess Meredith. Mickey calls Rocky a bum. He's incredibly mean, incredibly dismissive of him. And at this point, we don't know why. So we start off the movie where nobody respects Rocky Balboa. Not the woman in the pet store. Not Adrian, but the other woman who owns the pet store. Not the loan shark. Not the loan shark's driver. Not his coach. Not even like the 12-year-old child he's trying to take off the streets. He really...
Screw you, creepo.
Screw you, creepo. He really is a total nobody. But contrast that with Apollo Creed, John.
So this is played by Carl Weathers, and it seemed like they had several ideas of who to play Apollo Creed. One of them being Ken Norton, who famously fought Muhammad Ali. And Carl Weathers, I think, is fantastic. If you are looking for parallels, he is obviously modeled off of Muhammad Ali. But, there's a lot of Ric Flair in this. Here is just a supreme... This is the world champion. Well-dressed, well-spoken, business savvy.
Charismatic.
Yes. And I think, honestly, for this this era, a very strong portrayal of a black athlete for the time. Maybe this is just for me reading about Kamala for the last 2 days, but you contrast it to this. This was Apollo Creed is not a villain in this film. He is the adversary, and there's certainly a business and financial incentive for him to give Rocky Balboa this chance. But he's just presented as this larger than life heavyweight champion of the world in an era in the 70s when the heavyweight champion of the world was an enormous deal that everyone knew who that was.
What I loved, and I think what made Apollo Creed such an enduring character beyond this franchise, and ultimately in a way spitting off into his own franchise just simply based off of, I think, the legacy of the character, is the fact that he's not just portrayed as some mindless brute who's there to just play to his promoter's whim. He is not just a fighter, not just the best fighter, but he's also an incredibly savvy promoter who is a brilliant businessman in this movie. And I don't know how much of that is portrayed comes from the Ali inspiration. But the fact that you have in one person and in one excellent performance from Carl Weathers, somebody who's able to demonstrate both in-ring physical ability as well as mental ability and business savvy, I think that makes him incredibly likable to anybody who's watching this. And ultimately, just this incredible juxtaposition to Rocky Balboa, who is none of those things at the start of this movie, at least. He's not charismatic. He sucks as a boxer. And he's got no money at all. So we see Apollo Creed here. We know that Rocky looks up to and admires Creed because as he watches Creed on the news, the bartender there just insults him like any bartender would insult like some famous athlete. And Rocky actually gets offended by this. He leaves the bar because he's a fan of Creed's. So we learn that Apollo's opponent that was scheduled for January 1st has dropped out due to injury. And with no ranked fighters available, Apollo comes up with the great idea of allowing a local Philadelphia boxer a chance to compete for the world championship. And out of all the names that he could choose from, he decides on Rocky Balboa, simply based on his very relatable nickname of the Italian Stallion. So
the Italian Stallion.
The Italian Stallion. So yes, I mean, obviously, like, boxing and really combat sports, like, has always had such an element of like showmanship attached to it. But at least for me, coming from like more of a professional wrestling perspective, it's like where it's all showmanship. Elements like this I found incredibly fascinating, where, I think like to a layman, you would just think, oh, okay, boxing is like any other sport. Number one fights number two, number three, number one fights, and then it moves to number three. But combat sports aren't really all about that. Like, it's about what sells. It's about what makes sense. And to see like this discussion of Apollo saying this name is more important than the guy's record, I thought was really fascinating, especially for like a 1976 film.
They looked at the key demos and they knew what was going to hit, like Rocky Balboa with like the Italian population. And I was just waiting for them to talk about like, do we cut in Rocky Balboa to get pay-per-view points? But it looks like this was just thrown out on free television. So, I mean, the broadcasters, I mean, what was the cut here for Rocky Balboa?
Was it on television? Was there even TV? You're right.
It was.
Yeah. I don't know.
It was in story. It was New Year's Day of 1976. So that would have been on a Thursday night.
Incredible. So probably not pay-per-view. Probably not even invented at the time.
Yeah, I don't know if Fight TV was carrying Creed and Rocky Balboa. But this would give us the most cliched and tired narrative for any time that we had a mismatch in MMA or boxing. It's a Rocky story.
Yes, that is right.
And it allowed promoters to make fights that really were not that compelling, but they were forced to use someone who was greatly outmatched, and we had this tale to lean back on. Gives this person a chance. You never know what's going to happen.
Well, perhaps if, all these Rocky stories had an adjacent love story attached to it, maybe they'd be, maybe they would have worked just as well. Because that is certainly one of the themes of this entire film, is Rocky's developing love story with Adrian. He takes Adrian out on their first date. It's Thanksgiving.
Okay, we got her. Okay, yeah, go into this part. We'll talk about it at the end.
I'm sure you want to talk about Paulie here, because Paulie, even though Rocky says, like, hey, Paulie, make sure you tell her that I'm heading over. Paulie doesn't do that. Instead, just brings Rocky over, forcefully pressures Adrian to go out with him, even taking their turkey that she's been working on all day out of the oven and throwing it out the window, breaking her heart. These scenes are incredibly difficult to watch, and the viewer, I think, would quickly have an idea of why Adrian would appear to have such low self-esteem, because his brother treats her like shit.
There's this that's incredibly off-putting, but I'll say that to me, it's you put like a different piece of music underneath the scene at Rocky's home with Adrian. It's incredibly uncomfortable.
Completely. We shall talk about that, because they move on to the first date at the ice rink here, where really interesting bit of trivia note. This scene was originally intended to have multiple people in the ice rink, but because this budget didn't allow for so many extras, they had to make do with an empty ice rink. And Stallone would go on to talk about how he would have to like rewrite several scenes as they were in production. And this was one of the rewrites, where instead of a full arena of people and them interacting with the people at the ice rink, instead they had to do a scene in an empty ice rink. And Rocky convinces the Zamboni driver to let them use it for $15 for 10 minutes or something like that. And then on the ice rink, they bond, for the first time, bonding, it seems, over their parents' criticism of each of their flaws. Rocky's parents telling him that he should focus on his body because he has no brains. And Adrian's parents telling her to focus on her brains because she has no body. So these two quickly
What does that conversation go like?
Oh, God, I don't know. I have no idea. But, despite being on the surface, like these two feeling like incredibly different people, you understand that they are very good matches for one another because, as Rocky would say, they fill each other's gaps. So Rocky ends up convincing Adrian to go to his apartment. And, this is where you kind of alluded to, John, because we know the relationship these two would go on to have, because we have a good sense that Rocky is a good person. In the moment, I think we're fine. But Adrian exhibits a great amount of discomfort here, like not wanting to move things forward. And, to see like Rocky continue to be like, come on, come in here. It certainly, I don't know if like audiences would be so accepting of a scene like this in 2020.
Not at all, dude. Like, not at all. Like, this to me is like, it's the trope of, well, in the end, it turns out like they're a wonderful couple together. And Rocky, like, it becomes like a love story in like the later years. But I mean, this is to me just totally out of just a completely different tone to this film in 2020 eyes, that it was very off-putting to see how uncomfortable she was, that you lean back on the defense. Oh, she's naturally shy. Yeah, that doesn't mean that she is like forced into a guy's apartment. And it's just, to me, this is the most awkward scene of the whole movie to watch today.
So, I mean, you have to imagine like what was behind the thinking of doing a scene like this, because certainly I don't think Stallone ever intended to like give that impression off with the character. So I'm trying to think what they were trying to show. And
I'm sure the idea is that here's a woman and he's trying to get her out of his shell, and he's got to push her to get her out of her shell. But in doing so, you're completely taking away any of her kind of agency over her own, over her body, essentially. I'm sure they're not thinking at this level in 1976, but I mean, that's how you view it today. And it just tells you of like what was presented as like romantic and sweet in 1976 is like completely different today.
But I mean, it also kind of maybe tells you perhaps like what was going on in like Stallone's mind at the time. If he was in fact thinking that, in order to get this woman out of her shell, I have to be the man to like, continue to like drag it out of her. A completely different time. We're talking like 40 years ago when this film was written and produced. So I have to wonder like how prevalent that sort of thinking was. Maybe it was the norm at the time. But certainly in 2020, in the time since then, a scene like this plays a lot more as intimidation and fear, which, is fascinating. It's just an interesting study of like what this would have looked like at the time versus what it might look like right now.
Yes. As much as these movies that we'll look at in terms of like the plot and story, we're also looking at what the norms were of the culture at the time, that they believed like this was a script that we were presenting to an audience and how it was received in 1976, but also viewing it through, the benefit where I feel a scene like this would be rightfully panned today and heavily criticized, where I think there's less of a defense for this kind of portrayal.
So they end up making out, and this really continues, I would say, Adrian's like really tremendous transformation throughout the film. Like she starts off saying pretty much no words in the pet store, and then gradually through more of her appearances with Rocky in the film, we ultimately see her just continue to develop and turn into a different person. So Rocky at this point returns to his gym. We learn the reason why Mickey treats Rocky so badly. It's because he's disappointed in him. He threw away his potential to become a collector for a loan shark. Rocky at this point also receives a message from Creed's promoter, and he's thinking that
he also drops an ethnic slur on Rocky Balboa as well.
Oh, did he? Well, that's another sign of the times as well.
Yeah, I guess Burgess Meredith gets away with it with the age rule. That once you're a certain age, You're allowed to get it. It's the Archie Bunker rule, I guess.
If we had to go through like all these movies like from the time with like a fine tooth comb, many things will be very problematic, I'm sure.
Listen, this is like inside of a boxing gym. I am certain that this would be true to form of slurs that you would hear repeatedly.
So he receives a message from Creed's promoter thinking that Creed is looking for a sparring partner. Instead, Rocky Balboa is offered a world championship title match against the greatest boxer in the world, Apollo Creed. And the scene is really fascinating because Rocky's immediate reaction isn't happiness. This isn't the thing he's always worked for, because he didn't think that he was even in the guy's league. Instead of any sort of emotion, the guy just stares off into the distance. It's a blank stare, ultimately accompanied with a no. He turns the fight down, and the impression seems obvious in that the man is scared. He doesn't have the self-confidence to even entertain the idea.
Yeah, I thought this was like a really compelling part of the character, that here is someone that is just trying to make ends meet to just survive. And here he is given, like, this is the golden ticket in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And he's faced with this. This is, to me, like a really intriguing, like, theme that we see all over the place, of people that will talk about what their dreams are, what their goals are, but then when they face them right in the face, facing that pressure of, okay, now I can't just talk about this. Now I am faced with the chance to actually act upon this. And I think that this is a really compelling, hesitation on Rocky Balboa's part.
Throughout the entire, at least earlier portion of this film, at no point do we get the sense that Rocky's ambition is to become a world champion. And I don't know if that's because, he just gave up on that by this point, or if he just never had that. But I think to me, it seems like his ambitions lie kind of outside of boxing, in that I think he just wants to be recognized as somebody who's not just another, bum from the streets, as he talks about. Not necessarily, being a world champion, but as just like somebody who is not a nobody. So at this point, and
this fight will either disprove that or confirm it to the largest amount of people possible.
Mm-hmm. So after some convincing from the promoter, Rocky accepts. We see him on TV. He's still at this point a really shy person, not really knowing what to say in front of the cameras. And we also again catch up with Adrienne, who has begun her own subtle transformation. She's not wearing her glasses anymore. She's a lot more physically comfortable around Rocky. What an amazing couple of weeks. This was quite the transformation. It was pretty much overnight. LASIK surgery will, completely change a person, as you're well aware, John. You take off the glasses and boom.
It's just a different world.
So now Rocky is thought of as many people's tickets. Paulie wants to be in his corner. The loan shark gives him $500. And finally, here comes Mickey. Demeanor completely changed. Mickey walks to Rocky's apartment for the first time in 10 years of knowing the guy, and starts to begin his big sell to try to become his manager. Rocky immediately knows what this is about. He's disinterested, and he's even pissed off at Mickey and his fakeness. And in this one scene, so Burgess Meredith would go on to earn himself an Oscar nomination, and
totally justified.
He's in much of this film, but I don't know if he's in that much of it to warrant the nomination alone. But then you see this scene, and
this is what gets him the nomination. It's this scene.
Yes. Yeah, it's incredible. Best Supporting Actor nomination, along with Burt Young, actually, as Paulie. Mm-hmm. But Mickey says it's Rocky shuts him down. He doesn't want to coach. He's trained himself this whole time. He's going to train himself for this one too. And then he closes the door, and Mickey just whispers, "I'm 76." He's desperate. He's just saying it to himself. He carries around an old photo of himself reminding him of his glory days. But to me, the contrast is so interesting because you have Mickey here, who's just like, who's mean to other boxers like Rocky because he sees so much disappointment in them, perhaps from himself. And then you have Rocky, who's just been hardened by neglect in his whole life. Yesterday, he was just a nobody, and now everybody wants a piece of him, so he's telling the world to fuck off. He lets out a huge outburst of anger as Mickey leaves. It's the most emotion Rocky has shown all movie. And Rocky, even at this point, admits he knows why he's been chosen for this fight. He knows that he's just supposed to be a tomato can to get his face kicked in by Apollo Creed for people's entertainment. And how did you read all this, John? What did you think of this?
Jesus, I'm just pulling up Burgess Meredith and the films this guy was in. Holy Christ. Like, this guy just didn't stop working for his whole life. I couldn't possibly count all these films.
How many are we talking?
I've got to be staring at 100 movies here. Like, from 1935 until 2006. Well, 2006, he had died by then. I guess it's archival footage. Go to this guy's Wikipedia, and before you even get to television appearances that this guy made, holy Christ, was this a working man's actor?
Yeah, incredibly seasoned, and this probably being his most famous role.
This and Penguin. Those are my favorites.
Yeah.
Sorry, your question was?
Just asking your thoughts about this particular scene with the two of them in Rocky's apartment.
Oh, yeah, like this is one of the strongest scenes. I think this is where you are really brought into... the character of Mickey is like this hardened, old, boxing washout that, becomes like Rocky's like, the guy that's in his corner, like literally and figuratively. And this is where, like, up until this point, we have just seen all the turmoil between these two, and we kind of get to the root cause of this, and it's like the two coming together here in this pretty emotional scene for this 76-year-old that is, staring at the latter years of his life and trying to, I won't say live vicariously through Rocky Balboa, but he is Ric Flair in the promo from Raw on Monday night. That here's a guy that's right near the end, and he's not trying to take the spotlight from Randy. He just wants to be there and help.
And
Rocky did not punt him in the head down the flight of stairs at the apartment.
She shut the bathroom door on him. That's about as much as it went. Yeah, the end result is quite different because quickly after Rocky's outburst, like, inexplicably, Rocky just like... the way they did this was like incredibly interesting and unique because like one scene, like on the surface, is so jarring connected to the other. So quickly after this like very violent outburst with Rocky's most emotion he's shown the entire film, we cut to like an exterior shot as Mickey is really sad walking away from Rocky's apartment by himself, and then like you don't hear the dialogue, but you just see Rocky Balboa leave his apartment, go and shake Mickey's hand, makes up with him, and just like they seem to be in good spirits. So even like after this, you don't exactly know what's going on, but I think you have a sense that, hey, like they're cool now. So a lot I found was left to the viewer to like fill in that subtext. My assumption after watching this was like Rocky yelling about getting his face kicked in, to me, was like his admission to himself that he, again, is scared of this scenario. He knows he needs Mickey's help, but his bitterness towards him stops him from accepting it. But then, like, quickly after that outburst, like, he forgives and he puts the grudge away and decides to do what's best for his fight by getting Mickey to become his coach.
And thus begins the montage to get into fighting shape.
So the training begins. We see the famous scene of Rocky cracking up, like, what is it, a dozen eggs? Or
five eggs that he cracks and downs. And to me, still a scene that I can still dry heave when I watch this.
Yeah, 5 eggs is really a lot. I wonder how many people have, like, attempted this,
I'm sure there's a whole generation of kids who have tried this.
Yeah, I'm sure boxers are just like, let's get into like the zone. Let's drink some raw eggs. We see him first attempting to run the steps to the museum, but this time he cramps like hell And I thought that
I totally forgot about this part. Like they show where it's like the first days of training where he's just a mess going up those stairs by the end of it, and where it progresses to. But I like that you see this is very like every musical montage to convey a improvement over a period of time that we don't have the amount of time on film to to explain. So we're going to go through this with some music.
they actually didn't use like music necessarily. Like this wasn't, I would say, a proper montage, like the way you would see later on in this film, and especially in Rocky IV. This, you know, was just more, maybe I would say more so a collection of scenes, but certainly like him.
Oh, this is before we get the bigger montage
yes.
at the end. You're right.
Yes.
You're right.
So, but certainly, you know, seeing him run up the steps and failing, like, really provides a great visual gauge of his physical and mental readiness at this time. Like, I certainly like him running up the steps and failing, and then later on succeeding. I like that way better than having like a dude run on a treadmill and having a number like he's at 50%, and then later he's at 100%.
Wait till we meet Ivan Drago
Yes.
and his physical improvements.
Yeah.
This is also happening. He is getting ready for this fight in pretty much like, we know this is after Thanksgiving and before January 1st. So we're talking like 4 weeks of hard training to get ready for this 15-round fight.
Well, that was one of the things, is that they couldn't get any of the ranked fighters because nobody was going to take a fight against Apollo Creed on 5 weeks' notice. We see Paulie in a fit of rage, punching some meat. Rocky tries the same. Apparently, both this and the like running up the steps were like a part of Joe Frazier's actual training, which probably provided a bit more inspiration, and also uncredited for Sylvester Stallone here.
He got his cameo in the movie, though.
I guess so. Okay. Paulie asks...
Let's also not forget Mickey's number one rule: women weaken legs.
It's a common rule that we hear all the time in fight circles, don't we? The one person I've heard like say otherwise is like Frank Shamrock, who I believe it was like wasn't it a Fight Network Radio interview or something? It was something I've heard him talk about where like he says like he does not abstain at all before fights. He says it gets him into shape, in fact.
Oh, I remember interviewing him the day of his fight with Phil Baroni, and he came on with me, and I was asking him what he was doing in the hours leading up to it, and he's like, I'm going to go watch a movie. You know, it's just like another day for me. And just and that was it. And he beat Phil Baroni, a very memorable fight in June of 2007, which it turned out Shamrock, I think, like his knee was totally messed up going into that fight.
So, you know, we see Rocky punching meat. He's running with his dog Butkus, which is actually Sylvester Stallone's actual dog. But in story, it was given to him by Adrian from the pet store. And Adrian now, who like continues her transformation, she's like dressed up in like, you know, much more fancy clothing. Again, glasses off. She's very comfortable in her own skin.
Let's also remember, this has all happened in like 7 to 10 days.
Well, listen,
since their first date.
Listen, LASIK and maybe like a trip to Zara will completely change a person.
Zara? Was Zara in Philadelphia at this time?
I don't know. Well, yeah, of course.
Maybe they had a Macy's in Philadelphia. Yes. I don't know.
So, you know, I'm like, as a viewer, I'm on this ride with Rocky. Like I feel like I'm training with a guy. We know his life is shit. We know Paulie's life is shit. Everybody's life is shit here in Philadelphia. And we all know this man's hunger. And you contrast this type of training, his very down-to-earth, like literally raw training, to Apollo Creed, who we catch up with him. The guy isn't even training. Instead, he's worrying a lot more about the promotion and the business side of things. In contrast to like Rocky's relatability, Apollo Creed does not come across at all relatable. He's at a superstar level, and really more so at a businessman level, where you know, it's gotten to be such a perhaps twisted and mutated form of what pure boxing actually is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, they're really like setting the scene for like, this is a gigantic mismatch. He's a 50-1 underdog, and Apollo Creed is approaching it like that, which, I mean, it's probably not that far-fetched from, you know, what Muhammad Ali probably did ahead of the Chuck Wepner fight.
It's Christmas. Rocky and Adrian are caught talking about Paulie behind his back. Paulie bursts into the door, and it's incredibly tense. I will say honestly, like anytime Paulie's on screen, because the character is explosive. You know, you never know when he's going to get violent, and he certainly does here. Where Paulie blames his sister for him never having gotten married, and criticizes her for not being or at least like suggesting that she's no longer a virgin, saying she's busted. And I guess busted was like a really bad term at the time, John. You're busted.
I mean, he's just an awful individual in this film, like to a point that it's almost like irredeemable, and yet they would. Well, we'll talk about it in the films to come of where the Paulie character goes. But in this first film, I mean, even the idea of presenting like, oh, it's just this gruff exterior. It's like, man, it's an impossible character, I think, to look upon with any positivity in this first film, because he's just a complete asshole.
Like Burt Young ended up getting nominated for a Best Supporting Actor Oscar as well for this, and I can understand why, because yes, he's like terrible, he is incredibly mean, but he also has a bit of vulnerability attached to him, where you know he's doing all this because he's masking his own pain, and that comes across in a scene like this where he's just like, he's breaking down himself, saying that you should be nice to me, you should be such and such. And like, to me, these seem more like the words of a child, like who's not getting what he wants, or at least as somebody who is very like mentally stunted because of some personal trauma he was holding back in his life. And I don't recall if like the series ever really answers what that is, or instead just like kind of moves on. But the performance like behind this, and also behind what Adrian was going through, to me suggested like great levels of depth to these characters.
Oh, plenty. Like, just, you know, the character is reprehensible, but you're right. Like, they do key in on that. And Burt Young's performance is fantastic in this. Yeah, I don't confuse, like, the performance versus the portrayal of a character. And you're right. Like, there probably is, like, a much deeper story that you could go into about, like, the upbringing of these two and what kind of childhood that they had, where they are so shattered from a level of, like, confidence and a reliance on each other, even though one treats the other horribly, and the other is still so reliant on Paulie because that's the only person she knows to provide for her and take care of her. And yet he believes the same of her, that he treats her like garbage, but also that's his person that he leans on as well. So, I mean, there's a whole sidebar story that I think is an interesting one that I think could have been explored more, but it's very much focused on in this scene. It comes to a head.
So Adrian finally decides to move out, moving in with Rocky, and this is when we get our montage set to Bill Conti's "Gonna Fly Now," the first true montage of the franchise and the only one of this film before it became a cliche. I felt this montage was really earned. You know, like we see, in contrast to what we saw earlier with him failing at the steps, this time he manages to do it great. And it's just like, this is the culmination of his training. He, like, after the weeks and weeks of like waking up early, drinking raw eggs, and like punching raw meat, like he now runs through the streets of Philadelphia and is in tip-top shape representing the city.
Maybe one of the most famous songs when it comes to a film score than this. I mean, this is, to me, like, when I think of the Rocky films when I was a kid, it was this song that I immediately identified as it's one and the same. And when it would hit in any of those Rocky films, it was like, shit's on. You knew it was the climax of the film when this music would play, and it was just so linked. Like, to this day, I actually hate when fighters come out to this song because it's so cliche. But I mean, it's perfect. It was the perfect song to use for this scene and for this series. We
might as well talk a bit about Bill Conti right now, because it's absolutely this song, "Gonna Fly Now," and as well, for me, my personal favorite is "Going the Distance," which gets used later on in the actual fight. But to me, these are like the two of the best songs I think in any movie, for especially like a sports soundtrack. And the decision to use like classical music for something that was modern, I like, Stallone would talk about how it was sort of an unusual idea at the time, because originally the studio wanted to use rock, like even something like a Jimi Hendrix, for a soundtrack here. Which
maybe they could have had Enya if the generations met together. You could have Rocky preparing to Only Time.
Like Yoshihiro Akiyama?
It's a great song. A very underrated song.
Yeah. But, like the idea to use rock is certainly something they would go on to do, in future films in the franchise. But for me, like this film, the first one, is far more timeless than some of the others. And I think for me, much of that has to do with how timeless a soundtrack like this is compared to, Eye of the Tiger or, Hearts on Fire.
I hate that song.
Well, yeah, because it's corny now.
It is corny now, but I mean, the other thing, and it's like this will come up throughout all of this, whether it's like the casting of Carl Weathers or the use of this song, it's that we see the proof of this working. So it's hard to go back, and we have to look at, from the perspective going into this film, decisions that were made and looking at other alternatives. Like maybe some other ideas would have worked, but we know that these ones work because we have the evidence that supports that. So, like with any successful formula, you go back, well, the original idea was this, and of course it's going to sound like garbage because it would deprive us of what we saw and what worked so well.
It's weird because like this works so well, yet like in other films they would kind of stray away from this particular soundtrack style. But we will talk about those in the future. But this was this whole soundtrack was created on a slim budget of $25,000 for everything, which included Conti's composer's fee, the fee for the musicians, the rental for the studio, the cost to buy tape, everything. So didn't take a whole lot to produce, but ended up like being one of the most enduring themes for any film and a staple of every sports arena in the future.
Oh, yes.
So, also for this like training montage, I also need to note this because this, many people I guess have like talked about the cinematography in this film. This was one of the first films to make use of the Steadicam. And the Steadicam inventor, Garrett Brown, actually worked on this film. Some of these shots of Rocky running through Philadelphia, these tracking shots of him, and I don't know how much you might have noticed, John, but like they're completely stable. Like it's a camera on a truck, and that's following Rocky as he's running through the streets of Philly, and there's no shake at all. And at the time, this was completely revolutionary because no rig existed that would be able to absorb all of that movement until Garrett Brown came along and invented the Steadicam. So, it ended up like being something that was used pretty much in every major Hollywood picture following this. And
that tracking shot when he is full on sprinting, I think it's next to the train.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just like this dude is going 100%.
Yeah. And even like obviously Stallone got in great shape, but what if he just like did this once? It was like, okay, I'm done. Fuck this shit.
Rocky, we just want to get some coverage for if we need it, so we're gonna do a few more angles of this. Be like, go fuck yourself. you got one of those sprints in you if you're a non high level athlete, and I think after that his lungs would be exploding.
I'll save it for the sequel. So we approach the arena. Rocky gets a sneak peek of this empty place, which I believe was the LA Olympic Arena or something like that.
The Olympic Auditorium, maybe?
Olympic Auditorium, sure.
Yeah, famous wrestling venue as well. This is what this fight would have looked like if it happened today in the COVID era.
That is correct, yes. So Rocky stands there in the middle of this big arena all by himself. He's looking at a poster of Apollo Creed. And he's just feeling incredibly out of place. And, the cinematography really accentuates this, too, by having Rocky just be a very small speck in the middle of this great grand wide shot that was, you get the feeling that is really just designed by and for Apollo Creed, with him just having a small cameo. Even his poster is wrong because it does not reflect the proper color of his shorts. It's white on red instead of having red on white, which is his proper color. He asks the promoter, hey, my poster's wrong. The promoter says, doesn't matter, does it? Which further reminds Rocky that he's an insignificant part of this entire production. Now, what's interesting is that like this mistake was actually like a real mistake, and it wasn't intended at the time. They only weren't able to change it because they didn't have the budget to do another one of these posters. So rather than ignoring it and just using it, Stallone wrote it into the script, and it made for this like wonderful interaction that like just furthered the idea that Rocky is a nobody at a time when you feel like he's already at his best condition, best trained. It just shoots him right back down. And then we see Rocky go back to Adrian confessing that he knows he's going to lose, but at the same time he has decided that all he wants to do is to be the first man to go the distance with Apollo Creed. And he says that he believes doing so will prove to him for the first time in his life that he isn't just another bum from the neighborhood.
So he says, or he's basically saying, I could get wiped out in the scorecards if I make it to the end. That's my moral victory, which is a perfectly reasonable goal to attain here.
As a 50-1 underdog, absolutely.
Yeah. Mess up the sports books that have all counted you out and have everyone, that have put money on, their side bets to get stopped in the first 3 rounds, make them all lose their money.
We head to the night of the match. As mentioned, Rocky is a 50-1 underdog. He even enters in a role that's too big for him, advertising Paulie's meat company. Meanwhile, Apollo Creed comes in with his WrestleMania level entrance.
This was amazing. This was so awesome. I'd totally forgotten this entrance from the first film. He comes out and he's dressed as George Washington. He's throwing out like coins to the people, which to me, visually, should be throwing bills out. Like, it just makes for a better visual than it looks like he was just throwing out like crumbs to the people.
Bills are hard to handle with gloves, though, aren't they?
Yeah, he probably didn't have one of those little like things to like shoot out bills, but this guy could have been the originator of making it rain in this scene, and should have been. It just visually looks more, it stands out more for bills to be flying all over the place rather than coins.
It would be. But they couldn't afford it, probably.
Probably not. He might have been throwing away like birdseed or something for this particular scene.
So the idea immediately is that like we've seen Rocky's training for this whole thing. He's been working his ass off, where Apollo kind of gives the impression that he's mainly a showman who isn't taking the competition very seriously, preparing perhaps even more for an entrance than the actual fight here. He promises to end it in 3 rounds. And Rocky, like, I thought Stallone, like, conveyed his lack of confidence really well in these scenes at the beginning. He's just, like, he seems starstruck. Like, he seems he's just a fan who's, like, intimidated by the presence of, like, Apollo Creed.
Totally. He plays this fantastic. You have the vulnerability of him telling Adrian he can't do this. He's doubting himself. Like, here he is at the finish line, and he's got to be, he's got to run the race, essentially, to get to the finish line. And he's doubting himself. And I think it makes for a really great scene setter here where you see the difference of like his entrance versus Creed's, and the whole world is watching him in theory. And this is his chance to either confirm people's thoughts that who's this unknown, or to open everyone's eyes that he has something that Apollo Creed has never faced before.
We get into the fight, and immediately Rocky just eats a bunch of shots. Creed's just toying with him, but then Rocky knocks Creed down for the first time in Creed's career. Round 2 begins. Apollo is now taking it very seriously. He's dominating, but Rocky continues to fight back. This is when we hear Bill Conti's Going the Distance. Rap fans will know this as the track to Puff Daddy and Notorious B.I.G.'s Victory. And so shit's about to get serious. It's no longer just an exhibition. It's now a war. It's perfectly balanced. Rocky gets knocked down. He gets up before 10. Apollo is shocked. Both of them leave with great injuries. Rocky's eyes become hematomaed. Apollo's ribs are broken. Both are threatening their trainers to never think about stopping this fight. In a bit of another trivia note, they actually shot the final rounds first and then did things backwards, and that's because it allowed them to take the prosthetics off rather than, gradually putting them on, which would take more time.
Right.
So
because we just kind of breezed through rounds 3 through 14.
Oh, come on. It would have been really boring, I think.
I wanted that should have been the DVD extra, was the entire fight.
Probably would have been a lot of holding, a lot of stalling, and the soundtrack can only last so long, right?
But this was a hell of a 5-minute fight.
Hell of a 5-minute fight. Stallone had reportedly like pinned every single move beat for beat, and they rehearsed this like it was like a big, choreographed dance for weeks on end. Carl Weathers and Stallone. Apparently, Gene LaBelle was involved in this like choreography as well for these films. So, what a life that man's had.
Oh, Gene LaBelle, like what there really needs to be a book on Gene LaBelle and the impactful, like this was the referee for Inoki and Ali. Like the Hollywood work, the wrestling stuff, like that guy has had one of the most incredible lives that you can link to, from promoting, like being part of a family that promoted wrestling at the Olympic Auditorium right up to his influence on Ronda Rousey. I mean, it's an unbelievable career and life that Gene LaBelle has lived.
Is there a documentary about him that you know of?
I mean, there's been features and stuff on him. I don't think ever a full-length documentary, but I mean, he's still alive today, and he's very much, when you hear his interviews, like this is a worker, but someone that is just a great storyteller. 87 years old, this guy is, but it's...
And just connections to everybody.
Oh, yeah.
All that sports.
Like, just an unbelievable, like, link that he has to so many incredible historical moments in boxing, in wrestling, and mixed martial arts, and Hollywood as well.
We reached the final round. It's the 15th round. Rocky's Apollo Creed has not done what he said. He has not finished this fight in the third, but Rocky is close to achieving his goal. So Apollo, the fight finishes. Apollo says there won't be a rematch. Rocky says he doesn't want one. And we come to the conclusion of the film where it's such a interesting, like, unique approach to ending, a boxing fight on film, where we simply see Rocky in the moments following the fight being interviewed by TV people, asking him, "Hey, do you want a rematch?" Like, asking him all these boxing questions. But the camera is very tight and closed in on Rocky, who does not give a shit about any of this stuff. All he's looking for is Adrian in the crowd. He's just repeatedly calling Adrian. We don't even get a full, clear focus on the result of the match. We simply hear it in the background. But the camera still zooms in and focuses on Rocky's, prime focus here. And that's Adrian, who makes her way into the ring, tells him he loves her, she loves him, and he says it back to her, and that's how the movie ends. And in the background, if you were paying attention, Apollo Creed ended up winning a split decision. But what did you think of the way the film ended?
I knew, like, it goes off, like, the way it ends, but I did not recall, like, the specifics about how vague they left it, where it's very hard to even know that it was... Like, you hear the one, like, the Judge Walker scoring it for Creed, and then it's very faint in terms of, like, the split decision win. But, like, number one, I thought it was such a positive for the film that you didn't go... Because remember, this is not being written with the idea that we're going to pump out multiple versions of Rocky. Like, this is a one-off movie. Like, that's how it's written. And it would have been very easy to go with the cliche of the underdog upsets the world champion and wins. And I'm so glad they didn't do it that way, because I think this way, there's so much more respect for the character that even in defeat, you come away where he's proven everyone wrong and you've opened it up for a sequel as well. But I mean, the main takeaway here is that here's this guy who achieves this fictional goal of his, which is, accomplishing something by going the distance in this fight. But ultimately he realizes at the end of it that it is, this woman that he's in love with, that is the larger goal or accomplishment that he is there for. And again, that's why people will talk about this is much less of a boxing movie than it is. Like, this is a story of one man's journey, and boxing is very much just the backdrop to it. That, again, I go back to, like, the Chuck Wepner thing. It's like, okay, that was the inspiration, but, like, this is far more, like, boxing is, like, just the connective tissue, and it's not the larger picture of what this movie is, what the story is conveying. But I always enjoyed the way this ended and the way it was kind of left for, multiple interpretations as well.
I think Stallone probably saw that Ali Wepner fight and felt like, you know, so attached to Wepner's story as opposed to Ali's coming off of that fight. And I think an ending like this like perfectly helps you see that perspective, following the loser rather than the winner, by minimizing like the effect of this like result of this match, by not even really showcasing it whatsoever at the end here. You as a viewer realize that it doesn't matter what the result is of the match itself, because the result here is ultimately this man's achievement of proving to himself and proving to the world that he's not just a nobody. And more important than that, I suppose, sharing it with one person who understood his goal with him and shared his transformation with him in Adrian, who by this point, like, talk about a transformation. Like, she goes from somebody who's so shy, won't even talk to Rocky, to being confident enough to like open herself up to him by being the one to initiate, to tell her that she loves him. So to me, it was like almost a culmination of both of their stories at this point in time. But certainly, like, all of that is to say, what is important in both of their lives at this moment has nothing to do with the result of the match. And I think that's just beautiful, because so often I feel like we all just think about the result as the only thing that matters in any like type of thing that we attempt in life, but it completely neglects the journey, which I think a conclusion like this focuses on.
Yeah, and I mean, you always kind of view it by our present time that we're living in. And, the moral of the story at the end of it was that all of this pressure he put upon himself was to win the approval of strangers. That in the end, it was the approval of the people close to him that were of value to him, as opposed to, whether he won or lost this fight. That was immaterial, because, let's get really deep here, that with his eyes shut, his eyes were opened.
Wonderful.
To those around him.
Your overall thoughts on this film?
I mean, it's a classic film. I think it's, if you want to argue it's the best Rocky film, I think this is probably, this is the solid foundation that this whole franchise is built upon. And it'd be very interesting how this movie would have been viewed if they never produced another Rocky film. I think part of the lore of this franchise is the fact that it was so enduring across multiple generations and into the present day Creed films. But this on its own stands the test of time to me, save for some issues with certain portrayals in this film. But it also is a snapshot of the time period that we look upon here. But this is, I think it's an excellent film. I think it's the most, it also, you look at the backdrop to this and picking Philadelphia as much as what a perfect location to build this around. And a lot of it, this film gave Philadelphia itself a lot of character to those outside of the city. You think about Philadelphia, it only takes you a couple of seconds before you're thinking about the Rocky statue and those steps. To people outside of Philadelphia, this film is inextricably linked to that city and the attitude that we project on Philadelphia as being this tough, gritty city that Rocky Balboa embodied.
Completely. Yeah, for me, I feel like when I'm thinking back to my favorite films in the franchise, I think this one might actually be up there. And for me, so much of that is because it doesn't feel as gimmicky or as trendy as some of the future ones. To me, this is an incredibly minimalistic and very raw film, which is limited by, of course, its lower budget, which ended up making it, I think, a better movie because it forced the producers to be creative with a lot of what they had. And as a result, to me, it feels far more timeless than the other ones. I also love just how much respect it gives the viewer to lead themselves through the personal struggles of each character. Does not really spell out to you what every scene is supposed to mean. A lot of it you kind of have to infer yourself through, I would say, really good performances from several of the cast members here. Primarily Stallone, I thought was fantastic. Mickey was fantastic. I thought Adrian was great, and really Paulie was fantastic too. In all their limited roles, and Apollo Creed was fantastic. Every person here, I think, is very memorable. Visually, I think it's, considering like the budget, it's absolutely stunning. And it did a great job of capturing like the beauty of boxing and in extension combat sports. You have to imagine that, like how many people were inspired to become boxers or at least become boxing fans after watching this film.
Yeah, I mean, it has a gigantic legacy, like one of the most successful franchises, and one that, I mean, it put Sylvester Stallone on the map. I mean, it was this, and then to a lesser extent Rambo, but this is, I mean, he was the quintessential Rocky Balboa. Like, it's impossible to think of anyone else playing this role, even though there were other considerations. And this film goes on, as Wei mentioned, this thing cost $1,075,000 to make. Then they spent $4.2 million advertising the film. So think about that. They spent 4 times the amount advertising this film than they did on actually making it. And it brings in $225 million in 1976 dollars.
Yeah, adjusted for inflation, that's over like, oh God, is that
probably
like
over $500 million?
So 111 million is what it did domestically, and that adjusted would be 500 million. So like a worldwide box office of 225 at the time would probably be over that. That'd be like almost $1 billion, wouldn't it?
Let's see here.
So
yeah, $992.6 million in 2020,
and that's off of a production budget of $1 million at the time, which it goes on to say in the Wikipedia, this means that it had a percentage return of over 11,000%.
Jesus Christ. This was like the Matrix of it, or not the Matrix, the Blair Witch Project of its time.
Yes, that's right. It was the second highest grossing film of 1977, behind, any guesses, John?
Highest grossing, 1976?
77.
Oh, 77. That's Star Wars.
Yes.
Yeah.
So just behind Star Wars was Rocky. What a year for film that year. As far as awards go, it was nominated for 10 Oscars at the 49th Academy Awards, and
That's amazing.
It won 3 of them, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Film Editing. And
look at this lineup that they beat for Best Picture. This is a year that had All the President's Men, Bound for Glory, Network, which is an awesome movie, and Taxi Driver, which is I mean, these are all excellent movies. Mm-hmm. It's funny. I've watched Taxi Driver and All the President's Men not all that long ago, and now Rocky as well. I'm gonna have to watch Network again soon.
Would you say this is better than those two?
Man, I've got such a romanticism about All the President's Men. I really love that film. I don't think the wrong one won though. In Rocky 1. Taxi Driver is like a totally different film. Network is one that I think it holds up better today than it would have at the time. And kind of looking at the effect of introducing like profits and losses into the newsroom and how it dictated news coverage, that I think today carries an even greater weight than it would have in 1976. But that's a stacked top 5 for Best Picture. But Rocky winning is not shocking to me. Like, look at the performances that you just listed off in this film and the nominations that came with it. I mean, this was an unbelievably well-casted film.
Stallone was nominated for Best Actor as well as Best Original Screenplay, Best Actress nomination for Talia Shire, Best Supporting Actor nominations for both Burgess Meredith and Burt Young, as well. Best Music nomination, Best Sound nomination as well. So, we don't really have that much more to say about the legacy of this one. Certainly, I think there's a real interesting realization as we go through the series of how much the Rocky character ends up being a bit of a biographical role for Sylvester Stallone. And it starts off at this film where he kind of really comes from nothing and all of a sudden gets a chance to direct or write a movie for a relatively big budget. I guess being cast in a lead role is a relatively new phenomenon for him, and he ended up facing the stiffest competition imaginable in Hollywood, and in this case actually won and didn't lose, going up against several people at the Oscars. So
yeah, there was no split decision for Best Picture.
Nope, not at all. And throughout the films as we go on, we'd see him deal with fame and and everything much in the same way like Sylvester Stallone would in his real life. So it's really interesting how much this might mirror his real life.
Okay, let's go to the forum. We got a bunch of feedback here for the Rocky film, and we are kicking things off with John See No Evil. So happy you guys are doing this franchise, as it's one of my favorite movie franchises of all time. Although watching it back in 2020, the scene with Rocky trying to get Adrian in his apartment and what he does is very uncomfortable to watch now. Regardless, my second favorite movie of the franchise. Have you guys ever visited Philadelphia and done the Rocky tour? I try to at least once a year, and glad that Rocky ate at Pat's Steaks in it. Much better than Gino's across the street. Last I heard, Stallone still had those turtles, Cuff and Link. Yeah, the names are just awesome. Cuff and Link.
I've never been to Philadelphia. It's actually on my list of places to go to.
I was actually actually at the planning point at one time with some of my friends to go there, but we never did go to Philadelphia. It's just never been, a place I've gone to. But I would totally do the Rocky tour if I went there.
100%. Dan says, great idea for a review series. I love this movie. It's on my short list of movies where I see it on while channel surfing. I usually watch it till the end. What movies are like this for you guys? I'd also throw in Pulp Fiction, Shawshank Redemption, and Goodfellas on that list. I could say that never happens to me anymore because I never channel surf.
I think that's such a dying thing of just the idea of channel flipping is almost like we're removed from it so much that you sit down with, at most, you're maybe turning on your guide, but like it's something I don't really do. Like, oh, a movie's on, I'm going to watch that. Like 95% of the time I sit down, it's because I have something I need to watch that I'm about to watch. So I'm not really, maybe you and I are not the best people to ask about just casually watching movies. But in terms of ones like with rewatch value, because I have a pretty, I've watched a movie and I don't really need to see it again unless it's for like the purposes of like the show or something we're reviewing. Goodfellas would be on that list. Like I'm a fan of like the Scorsese gangster films. I could watch Scorsese films till the end of time. So I'd put Goodfellas on that list.
Yeah, I'm very much like that. Just like you, John, where like I watch things with intention now. And I don't necessarily like have the time to just even rewatch a lot unless like I'm watching it with a different perspective, really sitting down and trying to study it. So, I always enjoy like rewatching something because I always, tend to get something differently out of a film than I did the first time. But it's just, certainly the Marvel movies, I've seen them all multiple times at this point, and each time you get something new. And watching it in a different order, I think like watching it often, like we watch these films when they come out in theaters, and then we just like have these big gaps. But watching them in succession in a short amount of time together, opens up like new perspectives too. So I look forward to doing that with this series.
Okay, next up is Richard. So I'm glad you guys are discussing the Rocky series, which to me is one of the significant fictional American stories of both the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, when you count Number 6 and the Creed movies. Notice I didn't say the best, as let's face it, with Rocky 3 onward, quality is subjective. But that's another discussion for another day. Rocky is really part of a blockbuster wave of movies, along with Jaws and Star Wars, that broke Hollywood out of the 60s and early 70s domination of bleak, dark, internal stories that were the critical darlings of that time. Oddly enough, this movie was very dark and dirty looking as well. Of course, Stallone's screenplay and acting wouldn't win any awards, especially against that competition that year, but the movie as a whole was so winning that you couldn't help but cheer for it and liking it. When you realize how it won Best Picture and Director against classics like Network, a movie that was light years ahead of its time, All the President's Men, and Taxi Driver, it's more extraordinary. He mentions here Bound for Glory, the Woody Guthrie biopic, is always forgotten in all this, especially on this site as it brings back TNA memories. The next reviews, it will be more pointed about story, acting, music, etc. But watching this 44 years later, some scenes forgiven, it is a classic.
We go to Imran from Huddersfield, who says, great pick for a series to review. The first Rocky, while problematic in some places with 2020 eyes, still holds up as a sports movie and is probably still the finest example of the contender out of nowhere story. While I don't think Stallone is a great actor at all, I do think he's great as Rocky.
I disagree on that. Like, I think Stallone, we can look at so many awful films that he did produce. I think he's great in this film. And
well, that's what he's saying. He's saying he's great as Rocky, but are there other Stallone roles that you hold in high regard.
Okay, I see what he's saying. Like, yeah, I think it was like this was a character that you could see that connection to. Like, this was a guy that, I mean, literally put the words into this character's mouth, and he had the vision for it. That I think that's what makes him like so great and got such high praise for this portrayal. So I wouldn't say he's an awful actor, but I think it was, you know, a specific character that he was great at as opposed to being a guy that had a lot of range beyond that.
He says maybe that's being harsh on him, but nothing else he's ever done has come close to embodying a character as he does with Rocky. Question, do you think a virtual unknown coming in and challenging / winning the world title in wrestling could work as a WWE storyline today? Basically a 2020 version of 2002 Brock, but even quicker. Would the fans accept it, and would they ever do it?
Now, certainly it could work. Of course. Bring someone in that catches fire. Like, this is not, the first scene is not the fight. It's a 1 hour and 50-minute promotion to get to that point, so you are rooting for this guy. Like, that's what your television is. It's introduce a character, make people care about them, and then go somewhere. And I think certainly, you know, the history of wrestling, when someone new comes along and you just skyrocket them, more often than not, works.
I think the case of Brock Lesnar is very different because Brock, even if you don't know a thing about his backstory, he is so physically impressive that you don't need to know his backstory. And I think you're already attracted to him. Fans can immediately gravitate towards him as a champion, as a major act. If we're talking about a Rocky type of character, that person would need to be incredibly charismatic in their own underdog way, I think, to be put into a similar, like if we're trying to tell a Rocky story in professional wrestling with a guy who's a relative unknown, he'd have to just probably have to be a great promo. Maybe might have to, you know, just have a really relatable look that might work for its time. It would require something that I think would perhaps stand out about the guy. But as John said,
their Rocky stories are they bring in the guy that's the underdog and beat him like a drum to the point that no one does care about them. And that's happened in way too many cases.
Yes, unfortunately. Well, long-term storytelling.
That's right. You got to wait for it to play out. Mark writes, a classic, the best of the franchise, although best film and personal favorite of the franchise are separate distinctions. Stallone breaking out and the underdog. The Rocky films are the best way to also chart where Stallone is with his own standing in Hollywood. The later sequels of the 80s mirror his position in the industry, and then his return to the character in the last 15 years does the same. Excited to watch along with you guys.
Loud says, I saw this film, believe it or not, in a college film course. It is one of the first movies to use a Steadicam, I believe, to capture the action shots. Indie filmmaking on a Sylvester Stallone-sized budget. Still holds up as a classic. Creed was way ahead of his time as a character being portrayed in a 70s film. Love when he is studying and working out at the same time, he says.
And the last one here is Dwayne from Ireland. Great pick for your next review series. Even though the first 4 movies were released before I was born, I grew up obsessed with the series. Yes, even Rocky V. I was a kid. Though I didn't fully appreciate 1 and 2 until I was a bit older. Nowadays, the first film is my favorite, not just of the series, but of any film. The story alone of how the first movie was made and the tight budget, which led to instances like the scene where Rocky points out to Jurgens that he's wearing the wrong colored shorts in the poster because they didn't have enough money to replace the poster, along with the fight Stallone had to put up just to play the title character, could all probably be a podcast of its own. I would say if they were really sticklers for consistency, I would say, let's not make an entire new poster. Let's get different tights.
They might have not had enough budget for that either. I think Stallone preferred the red with white trim. And they just didn't have enough to change a whole poster. The
key to anything like that, those holes, is acknowledge them, and then people don't have a gotcha moment for them to make it an error.
The problem is
we know.
The problem is, you often, in this film, they came up with incredibly creative ways that fit with the story to explain inconsistencies like that. Now, certainly they could have done something like this for the color of the Hummer changing from black to white in WCW. But they never bothered.
Kevin Nash pop into the screen and say, doesn't really matter, does it?
Took it for a paint job, of course. Tried to hide it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there you go. That was Rocky 1, the first of our series of Rocky film reviews. And Rocky 2 will be next month, which will be coming out on September the 8th. So everyone has a month to go rewatch Rocky 2, whether it be on a digital version, DVD, or maybe a VHS copy.
How did you watch this one?
I bought it on YouTube, or I rented it on YouTube, I should say.
Because I know you have it on VHS.
Well, it was funny because I was at my parents' house on the weekend and was going through some stuff, and I had watched it the night before I had rented it, and just by chance found the box set of films, and so I took a picture of them. But I did not watch this because I found the VHS tapes. The problem is I don't have a VCR.
Okay. So and also you couldn't 2X it.
What's that? No, I watched this on normal speed.
You did? Okay,
yep,
wow.
Yep.
Well, maybe Rocky 2 or maybe Rocky 5 will be a 2Xer. We'll see.
Rocky 5 might test everyone's limits, but that's months away. So we have time to prepare for Tommy the Machine Gun.
So we'll be back with that next month, and who knows? I'm hoping perhaps we can get some guests on for future reviews. Wanted to do this one with John Solo, but if there are people you would like to hear talk about this film on this podcast review, do let us know who you'd like to hear from the Post Wrestling family.
We'll reach out to Carl Weathers.
Oh God, I'd talk to him about Happy Gilmore. Forget Rocky. So what's coming up here next week?
So next week on Tuesday in this time slot, we will be having Rewind-A-Wai number 77, and we had put out a poll asking people which Royal Rumble would you like us to review. This was courtesy of Ian Kushner, who is our Espresso executive producer, who lent it to you. He said, I want you guys to pick a Royal Rumble and the people can vote. And the poll is, I am officially closing it because
closed.
we had a clear-cut winner of the selections. We had the Royal Rumbles from 91, 95, 99, and 2001, and overwhelmingly, 42% of you voting for the Royal Rumble from 2001, featuring that year's Rumble, as well as Kurt Angle versus Triple H for the WWF Championship, Chris Benoit and Chris Jericho in a ladder match as the highlights, and Drew Carey on top of it.
Oh, come on, that in itself probably worth a review alone. But just to give you guys a sense of what came in second place. Second place was Royal Rumble 1999, followed by 91, and then the poor mid-90s Royal Rumble 1995 coming in last.
My choices don't hit well with people, but I was shocked 1999 did as well, because that's a god-awful show. It's probably the worst Royal Rumble.
I think people more so look at the year and more so what the roster might have been at the time. I mean, any of these Attitude Era ones, in particular 2001, right before WrestleMania 17, going to be very well remembered. So looking forward to talking about that with you next week, John.
Yes, 2001 Royal Rumble next Tuesday. And then 2 weeks from now, we will have another Ask Away, if I have my dates right. So, yes, that is what is coming up. We will also be back Friday night with a live Rewind-A-SmackDown, 10:15 p.m. Eastern Time for all of you to tune in, and you can call in as well. We will be getting to your phone calls, and lots coming up in the coming days, including our UFC 252 post-show that will be coming out live Saturday night right after the fights at youtube.com/postwrestling. So thanks to everyone for posting feedback to Rocky 1, and now you can go dive into Rocky 2, the rematch.